Okay, so let's get started. I am going to be talking to you today basically about the transformation of politics in Britain in the 1950s through to the 1970s. And I'm going to be talking about that partly as a consequence of the rising standards of living and the debates about affluence and who was affluent and who wasn't, and how it was to be achieved, and partly by thinking about how that in itself had the consequences for the understanding and conduct of politics. The key thing that we need to start by remembering is the point that I was drumming home to you on Tuesday, that we're now talking about a new social democratic system of which the two key components were the idea of a mixed economy of public and private ownership and of a welfare state that would provide universal coverage to the population. And as you'll remember, because I was just relentless in making this point on Tuesday, I was trying to explain the way in which the foundation of that system was from the outset compromised, not just by continuing differences of class and gender and of race, but also by the material limitations in terms of the financial resources available and of the continuing reliance upon a broadly Victorian infrastructure. But what you need to grasp is, even though that system was established by the Labour government after 1945, there was a general agreement that around the operation of the social democratic system. All three political parties, the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party and the Labour Party, were all committed to the idea of the welfare state and to an understanding of the new mixed nature of the economy, of this balance between public and private ownership. And in a way, the most remarkable achievement of the post-war Labour government was to completely shift the political ground onto this territory and to have the Conservative Party come to embrace its fundamental assumptions by the end of the 1940s. In that sense, I'm going to be talking to you today about the way in which social democracy became a sort of the common sense of the age, in the same way that liberalism was the common sense of all political parties in the 19th century. It's very important to recognise that this is a system in which there were difference of emphasis placed by the political parties, but everyone basically signed up to its central assumptions. The Conservative Party put a little less emphasis on the role of the state in everyday life and wanted to have a slightly different balance between the levels of public and private ownership. But effectively, there was a general consensus. And all equally agreed that the principal task of government was to improve the lives of the population and to generate rising standards of living. Okay? That's a really important point. And in many ways, politics and the measure of success of governments became about how effectively they managed the economy and the welfare state to deliver these rising standards of living. You can see this, I think, very clearly in this political poster from the Conservative Party. It's precisely stating its claim on the idea that the standards of living should be improved for all. Now, it wasn't just the ideological content of politics, this shift into a general acceptance of social democracy, that had changed in the post-war period. It was also the very understanding and form that politics, the understanding of politics and the forms in which it was conducted, also changed. You remember that in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, we looked at the emergence of what I described as a recognisably modern political system around mass political parties, the idea of a secret ballot, and the central coordination by parties of the distribution of election posters and election literature. Now, in the post-war era, after the Second World War, the conduct of politics was transformed by the role of television and of advertising in new ways. In many ways, it's during this period that we have a new understanding of politics as almost another type of commodity, and something that had to be sold to citizens as consumers in new types of ways. So let me begin by talking about the achievement and the limits of affluence and rising standards of living in the post-war decades. And I'm going to start by playing you a delightful Noel Coward song.
Lord Elderly, Lord Bonavier, Lord Sickert, and Lord Kent, with every virtue, every grace, are what avails the sceptred race. Here you see the four of us, and there are so many more of us eldest sons that must succeed. We know how Caesar conquered all and how to whack a cricket ball. Apart from this, our education lacks coordination. Though we're young and tentative and rather representative science are a noble breed, we are the products of those homes serene and stately that only lately seem to have run to seed. The stately homes of England, how beautiful they stand, to prove the upper classes have still the upper hand. Though the fact that they have to be rebuilt and frequently mortgaged to the hilt is inclined to take the guilt off the gingerbread and certainly damps the fun of the eldest son. But still we won't be beaten, we'll scrimp and screw and say the playing fields of Eton have made us frightfully brave.
Okay, that's quite enough, much as I'm a fan of Noel Coward. So this is Noel Coward's very famous song, The Stately Homes of England, about the decline of the aristocracy and the symbolic state of the stately homes, which had been falling in large numbers after the First World War. This song was published in 1938, and in many ways it provides a sort of wrong steer, in the sense that in Chamberlain's government at that time, there were 10 peers of the realm that were members of the government, and no less than 30 peers had been elected to the House of Commons in 1935. So it wasn't as though the political system had become devoid of the aristocracy, even though their stately homes were in a deteriorating state. Nonetheless, one of the interesting features about the 1950s, which was marked by the victory of the Conservative Party in 1951, was a growing visibility, if you like, a return to prominence of the aristocracy. And in many ways, the great example of that was the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953, which was, for the new Conservative government, worked slightly as a counterpoint to the Festival of Britain. It provided a very different image of the future of the post-war post-war country. It presented Britain as an old country structured by traditional relationships of class and authority, and it also, in marked contrast to the Festival of Britain, made the empire centre stage to the coronation festivities. Nonetheless, despite that sense of continuity or the reinvention of the royal family or the attempt to reconsolidate the place of the royal family, it was a new type of royal family. The royal family had been in something of a crisis in the 1930s, most famously because of the abdication crisis in 1936 when Edward VIII was not allowed to marry Mrs. Simpson and abdicated. And many felt that this could have been a defining moment for the collapse of the British monarchy. Instead, under Elizabeth, it is reborn, and it's reborn in a new televisual age. The relationship between the monarchy and television gets cemented in 1953. Something like 20 million people are reported to have watched the coronation ceremony on TV. Many people bought their first TV sets in order to make sure they could follow the festivities. And thereafter, Queen Elizabeth is very adept at using television to expand and project her place in the national story. Most tellingly, with her regular Christmas broadcast that began in 1957. They broadcast every year at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the understanding that everybody's had their big Christmas dinner, and you would all go off and watch the TV. And it starts with the national anthem. My grandfather always used them. We always had to make sure we'd finished our Christmas dinner by 3 o'clock, and my grandfather would always stand up, during the national anthem, and then we would all sit down as a family to hear what pearly words of wisdom the Queen had. So a new type of monarchy, a new televisual monarchy, a new projection of the royal family. It was very important that Queen Elizabeth was a woman. She had children very quickly. Her first daughter, indeed, had the first televised royal wedding in 1960, and it seemed as though everything was mended in the royal family. But it wasn't just the royal family who had a new prominence, it was also the aristocracy. In many ways, in the 1950s, you see the aristocratic season, the sort of high aristocratic season, marked by the balls of debutantes coming out at age 21, of leading aristocratic daughters being the principal modelers in the fashion industry, often through those debutante dresses and so forth. The activities and the dress of the aristocracy at Ascot and at the Royal Box at Wimbledon during the emergence of new types of fashion pages, all of these placed the aristocracy in an increasingly prominent and visible role in the 1950s. And indeed, the Conservative Party continued to be intricately connected to this aristocracy. Churchill, its leader, obviously, immediately after the war, was as aristocratic as anyone. Many of the other leaders of the Conservative Party in the post-war era, Anthony Eden, Harold Macmillan, Lord Douglas Hume, all aristocrats. In fact, the first non-aristocratic leader of the Conservative Party was Edward Heath, and he didn't become a leader of the party until the 1970s. The Conservative Party was also predominantly a product of private schools. 75% of Conservative MPs were privately educated, as opposed to just 20% for the Labour Party MPs. And, of course, both political parties continued to be predominantly male. There were only 24 women MPs in 1945, and it basically remained at that level until 1987, when 41 women were elected to Parliament, and then in 1997, when 120 women were elected to Parliament. So the question then is, how is it that the Conservative Party, still associated with privilege and aristocracy, became the party of power, basically for the next 2 decades in a new social democratic Britain? They basically come to power in 1951. They win 3 successive elections, and they don't lose until 1964. In many ways, it's the same question that we grappled with after the First World War, when the Conservative Party were also, and under Stanley Baldwin, also a dominant presence. So there are various ways in which historians have tried to explain this. One is to say that the Conservative Party were much more in tune with the needs and the desires of the British people. And in particularly, that they were much more in tune with people's desires as consumers. And in a way, the best example of this was the formation of this organisation, the British Housewives League, in 1945. The British Housewives League claimed 100,000 members by 1947, and its biggest campaign was against the reintroduction of bread rationing in 1946, when it managed to collect 500,000 signatures against the measure. Basically, what the British Housewives League wanted to do was to withdraw the state from the running of people's everyday lives, and rationing for them was the perfect example of the way in which the experts in the state were telling people what and how they should consume. The British Housewives League also was deeply critical of Labour's policy of nationalisation, and began to speak increasingly vocally against the state involvement in the economy, as did other fringe groups around the edges of the Conservative Party, probably most famously the organisation called the Aims of Industry, which was set up by a group of industrialists in 1942. So when the Conservative Party ran its campaigns in 1951, it did so under the slogan of setting the people free. Setting the people free from the austerity measures and the controls that the Labour Party had kept them under. Now, setting the people free for the Conservative Party was not about returning to a pre-war understanding of the free market. It was just a retreat from the overbearing influence and activity of the state. And the end of rationing was a key part of their campaigns. And as we can see, they end food rationing in 1954 and close the rationing of clothes and furniture in 1958. Allowing the people to make their own choices as consumers was a really important theme in Conservative political literature. They also, as I said to you on Tuesday, sought to try and deliver more in terms of the provision of public housing. The Labour Party had been providing up to 200,000 new public houses a year up until 1951. The Tories claimed that they would increase it by 100,000, and they did so between 1951 and 1957. Just as importantly, the Conservative Party recognised that citizens had a growing aspiration not just to be housed in new public houses, but to be property owners themselves. The dream of Britain finally becoming a property-owning democracy was one that was very important. There had been just 27% of the population were owner-occupiers in 1947. And then finally, they of course wanted to set the people free from from what they considered to be the burdens of too higher rates of taxation. So the top rate of tax was cut from 47.5% to 38.75% during down to 1959. Let me just say one more thing before I go on here. In this climate, under the Conservative Party, wages grew at a pace that outstripped the cost of living by twice. Okay, so people were becoming increasingly better off. Their wages went much, much further than they ever had done before, and inflation was largely kept in check during the early 1940s. As a consequence of this new amount of surplus income that many people had, consumer expenditure rose by 45% between 1952 and 1964. 45% between 1952 and 1964. It was in this context that the Conservative Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, who came in to replace Anthony Eden after the Suez Crisis in 1956, which I'll talk to you about on Tuesday, made his famous speech where he said, "Most of our people have never had it so good. Go around the country and you will see a state of prosperity such as we have never seen in my lifetime, nor indeed in the history of this country." The Conservative parties were highly effective at laying claim to the economic recovery as the work of their own policies. But in fact, we need to be slightly suspicious of this claim for a couple of reasons. The first is that we know that the 1950s and the 1960s were a period of economic boom across Western Europe and indeed in the US as well. In many ways, the European economy was set afloat again by the Marshall Plan in the period immediately following the war. And Europe's prosperity in this period was, of course, part of Cold War politics. The very idea of keeping people's standards of living up in Europe was to try and avoid the spread of communism from the Berlin Wall west. That's the first reason why we have to be suspicious. The second is that really, in key elements, the economic policies of the Conservative Party weren't that much different to those of the Labour Party. And so historians now describe this period of time as being characterised by so-called Butskillism. Hugh Gaitskell had been the Chancellor of Exchequer under the Labour Party up to 1951, and Butler was the Chancellor of Exchequer under the Conservative Party. So Butskillism was about the joining of these two names. Both of them basically agreed about the centrality of Keynesian demand management of the economy and the use of national economic management to secure the security and prosperity of full employment. And as I said, government becomes responsible for delivering economic growth in an entirely novel way. And these governments become judged by their success at delivering this. Butler claimed in 1954 that he would double the standard of living of the British people in 25 years. A very bold claim. And in important ways, you can see just how successful these economic policies were. GDP grew at a rate of 2.8% between 1951 and 1978. Unemployment remained below 2%. Infant mortality, a key indicator of poverty, fell, thanks in large part to the new Nationalised Health Service. Home ownership grew from 30 to 50% during this time. The numbers of houses with washing machines grew from 7.5% to 67%. Britons even began to get fridges in their households. 68% had fridges by 1978. And TVs. Households began to have TVs, 90% by the middle of the 1970s. And these new figures that mapped out the scale of economic growth and prosperity came as a consequence of new ways of measuring economic performance. Okay? There was a much, much greater statistical knowledge of the performance of the national economy than there ever had been before the First World War. So the standards of living were mapped by the Retail Price Index and wage standards. They had been around before the First World War, but new measures of industrial productivity and of productivity rates, output per man hour, emerged in the 1940s and 50s. And internationally, the British economy was compared through measures of gross national product, shares of world trade, and productivity rates. All of these new types of economic measures came out of the work of the United Nations and the Organisation of European Economic Development in the early 1950s. So citizens had new types of ways of measuring the success and the performance of government. But before we think that everything was fantastic in the 1950s and 1960s, we have to also recognise that there were real limits to the new affluence and prosperity in post-war Britain. All of these new economic statistics may have demonstrated that Britons had never had it so good, but they also tended to emphasise that Britain's economy was performing less well in relationship to its competitors. So not surprisingly, the Conservative parties emphasised personal consumption and the rising standards of living, whereas the Labour Party, during the 1950s, when it's in opposition, increasingly focuses on the so-called decline of the British economy in comparison to its international competitors and called repeatedly for a new wave of modernisation. And you can see why that debate became so important, because Britain did indeed have the lowest GDP in Europe in the 1950s and 1960s. Britain's export industries basically collapsed. Its share of world exports fell from 25 to 10% from 1950 to 1975. And the British government was continually fighting a